They didn't fire me. Not yet. They just cut my salary by 40%, removed me from every meeting I used to lead, and reassigned my core responsibilities to someone who hadn't even finished her first year. Her name was Ava. She was 24, smart, cheerful, fast with spreadsheets, and also the CEO's niece. No one said it directly, but everyone knew. She walked in like she already belonged, and maybe she did. Me? I was Rachel, research analyst, 6 years in. I'd built the review process for clinical trial data from scratch. The job wasn't sexy, it wasn't loud, but it saved the company millions in liability. My role was to make sure that what we submitted reflected what was real, not what looked good. I didn't get a warning before they made the switch, just a short email from HR. Departmental restructuring, compensation review, temporary reassignment. All carefully chosen words. But I knew what it meant. They weren't ready to fire me. Not yet. Maybe I was still useful in the background. Maybe I was just the backup plan in case the niece made a mistake. Or maybe I was being positioned, quietly, strategically, as the one to blame when that mistake became public. So I didn't argue. I replied once, asked for a written record of my revised responsibilities, got it. And from that moment on, I did only what was listed. No more, no less. Ava moved fast. She skipped steps I used to insist on, rounded decimals, reorganized datasets. She smiled while doing it, said it made the reports cleaner. What she didn't say was that she'd never handled raw data from a failed trial, never dealt with a client asking why numbers didn't line up, never held a mistake in her hand and felt the weight of what it could cost. But I had. And now I was no longer invited to look. Jared, the intern who used to shadow me, stopped by my desk a few days later. He asked, "So, are you still reviewing her reports?" I shook my head. I only work on what's in my scope. He didn't get it at first, but later that week, he saw Ava submit a summary with numbers that didn't match the logs. He looked at me again, like he wanted me to step in. I didn't. I let the numbers go through. I let her sign them. I let them circulate, because that wasn't my job anymore. They had taken my name off the reports, but left it in the memory of everyone who used to rely on me. They thought removing me would make their process faster, cleaner, easier to control. Maybe they were right, for now. But I knew this kind of speed, it looked efficient until the first real audit. So I started tracking something else. Not the data, the decisions, who made them, when they made them, who said yes, who didn't say anything at all. Because when this fell apart, and it would, I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to point fingers. I was just going to have the timeline ready, neat, documented, and very, very quiet. Ava didn't take over slowly. She moved in like she'd been waiting. Her name started appearing in places mine used to. Meeting invites, data requests, internal updates. I watched her click through reports I used to triple check, nodding like everything made sense. Sometimes she even used my old phrasing, the way I flagged inconsistencies, the structure I taught Jared to follow. But there was no second pass, no hesitation, no trace of doubt. She was confident. And that was the most dangerous part. Clients like clean numbers, executives like short timelines. Ava gave them both. She compressed what used to take 3 rounds of validation into one polished PDF, and they applauded her for it. "She's so efficient," I heard someone say. "She gets it done without overcomplicating." They meant she didn't ask questions, and questions were the only thing that ever kept us safe. Jared stopped me in the hallway one morning. "She submitted a draft yesterday without running a control match," he said low. "We always check that. Should I say something?" I looked at him, calm. "Did she ask you to review it?" "No?" "Then you don't own it," I said. He looked uncomfortable, like someone being handed a mirror he didn't want. I understood that look. I wore it once. That day I opened the team dashboard, not to interfere, but to observe. I scrolled through the logs, noting which files had been touched and when. I saw my name still listed under technical oversight on one project I hadn't seen in weeks. So I flagged it, not with a complaint, just a time-stamped note. No access granted to this project post March 12th. It wasn't confrontation, it was clarity. Ava sent out another report that afternoon, a summary of trial data from a device calibration test. From a distance, it looked fine. Well-structured, formatted perfectly, colorful graphs. But I recognized the numbers. They looked too stable, too neat. Real data fluctuates. Hers looked engineered. Still, I said nothing. I wasn't paid to say anything. Instead, I copied the file's metadata, logged the submission time, noted who approved it, and moved on. That week, she held a meeting to streamline the workflow. She talked about skipping unnecessary backchecks, said we could trust our process more. Her voice was bright, confident, polished like a TED Talk. People nodded. I watched silently from the back of the room. She caught my eye once, smiled. I didn't smile back. Not because I was bitter, but because she didn't realize what she was carrying. She had taken the seat, but not the weight. That was coming. And when it did, I wasn't going to catch it. The first flagged report didn't come from inside. It came from a client. A week after Ava submitted her trial summary, the company we were working with, one of our quieter partners, replied with a short message. No accusations, just a question. Could you confirm the variance range on these results? I read the message twice. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even suspicious. But it was exactly the kind of question I used to catch before a client ever saw the file. I didn't answer it. It wasn't mine to answer anymore. Instead, I watched as Ava scrambled to open the original dataset. Her face stiffened. She opened a second file, then a third. The numbers didn't line up. They were clean in her report, but chaotic in the raw form, something she'd averaged out without adjusting the controls. She turned to Jared. Did you change any of these before I submitted? He shook his head. I didn't touch them. I assumed you ran the check. She looked at him like he'd let her down, but she hadn't asked. And he hadn't offered. I sat at my desk, still working on a completely unrelated project. No expression, no comment. The next day, Ava forwarded the client's question to 2 other people, looping in managers, adding context, padding the reply. But not once did she mention the skipped validation step. She was hoping the question would go away. It didn't. The client followed up, politely asking for the source tables. Jared came to me again. She's panicking. I think she wants me to go in and revise the file, but... Did she ask you directly? I said. Number. She just keeps looking at me. I didn't respond right away. I waited until he looked unsettled enough to really listen. Then let her look, because that's what happens when you take on a role for the title, not the responsibility. You think everyone around you will pick up the parts you drop, but sometimes they don't, and I had stopped picking up dropped pieces months ago. That afternoon, Ava sent a clarification email to the client, offering an adjusted version of the summary, but by then, it was too late. The client had already copied our quality assurance team and requested a full log of revisions, which meant it was no longer a conversation, it was an audit. And the first file they asked for, the one she submitted with my name still listed under Review Contributor. I didn't say a word. I just pulled up the audit request, found the timestamp, and attached my reply. No access, no edits, not involved. That was all. No emotion, no warning, just a line. And as I closed the tab, I realized they didn't need me to expose the flaw. They just needed me to stop hiding it for them. So I did. Ava called it just a check-in, a light audit, a procedural thing. She said it in that breezy tone she always used when she was trying to make chaos sound like coordination. But I had seen audits before. This wasn't a check-in. This was a prelude. The client had flagged the data once, then twice. They hadn't accused us yet, but they didn't need to. All they had to do was start requesting originals. That's how real investigations begin. Not with a headline, but with a question no one expected to answer. Ava stood in front of the team with her usual glow. She spoke about collaboration, efficiency, how proud she was of everyone's agility during recent deadlines. Not once did she mention the report that triggered this. She didn't mention my name either, but it was still there. Not in her speech, but in the metadata. The report she submitted used a recycled template from one of my old projects. She had rushed to publish, reused the format, and forgot to clear the technical contributor field, which meant my name, my ID, was still tied to the file that had triggered the client's concern. To most people, that would look like I reviewed it, but the log said otherwise. No login from me, no edits, no downloads, no involvement since March 12th. And Malik, the internal auditor, had already noticed. He reached out with a short message. Director, calm. Can you confirm whether you had any role in the Averian submission? I didn't stall. I did not. My scope was formally adjusted on March 12th. I have had no access or engagement with that data since. I attached the HR letter, the timestamp of my last system login, and a sentence confirming the removal. I used no adjectives, no frustration, no defense, just clarity. Malik responded with a thank you and nothing more. But I knew what that meant. He wasn't confirming my role. He was drawing a line between what could be blamed on me and what couldn't. Jared came by my desk later. He didn't speak right away. She told the client you were still involved. She said, you were guiding her from behind the scenes. I didn't look up. She never asked me to review anything, I said. You saw that. He nodded, quiet, almost ashamed. Not of her, of himself. I thought maybe you'd still keep an eye on it. I did, I said. I kept an eye. I didn't lay a hand. He didn't speak again after that. Meanwhile, Ava was unraveling faster than she realized. Malik's questions widened. He started checking timestamps, cross-referencing message logs, tracking edits. Her responses were long, too long, full of soft justifications and phrases like, as far as I recall, and based on previous norms. But audits don't work on feelings. They work on entries, and her entries weren't matching. She messaged me again that evening. Just one line. Can you confirm if you reviewed the first draft before submission? I read it twice, then replied, no, I was not involved at any point. She didn't answer after that, and she didn't show up the next morning. The draft she'd submitted wasn't hers alone anymore. It had my name on it, visibly, even though the system logs said I'd done nothing. But those two things together made the worst kind of contradiction, one that couldn't be explained without exposing the truth. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just stayed still, stayed precise, because the file may have carried her signature, but the log carried mine, and one of them was lying. The message wasn't harsh. It came with polite wording, careful punctuation, and an empty kind of professionalism. The client simply said they'd like to pause phase 2 of the study, pending further internal review. That single sentence landed heavier than anything else all week. People didn't say what they feared. They didn't have to. The tone had changed. And when tone changes, trust is already gone. Inside our team, no one mentioned the flag numbers. They just started speaking more carefully. Meetings felt colder. Every draft had more eyes, but fewer approvals. And Ava, the one who used to run through updates like a podcast host, was suddenly quiet in every room she entered. She wasn't being punished. Not officially. But her voice no longer held the room. She came back from her second day out looking more tired than before. Her smile had cracks now, and she stopped standing up when people walked past her desk. I didn't say a word to her. She didn't look my way. But that silence had a weight to it, one she wasn't trained to carry. Jared sat beside me during lunch, tapping his finger against his leg like it might explain what he couldn't say. She told the client you were still involved, he said, that you were reviewing reports off the record. I let him sit with that sentence for a moment. Then I replied, I haven't touched a single draft since the day they reduced my role. He nodded. Slowly. The sound of his breath was louder than his response. That afternoon, I got a message from Malik, short, like always. Were there any informal handovers or side reviews after your scope ended? I answered without delay. None. No requests, no verbal instructions, no silent expectations. I complied fully with the scope I was given. I attached nothing. He didn't need evidence this time. My name had already disappeared from every system that mattered, except the one they forgot to check. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The real reply came 2 hours later when the leadership meeting calendar changed from project sync to risk containment. No one told me what happened in that room. They didn't have to. The energy shifted again. People walked slower. Ava's chair stayed empty after 3 p.m., and Jared didn't ask any more questions. By the next morning, the client had requested to speak with someone from compliance directly. Not from our team, not from Ava, not from leadership. They wanted facts, not voices. That was when it clicked for the rest of the company. They hadn't lost trust in a person. They'd lost faith in the process. Ava had made a mistake, but it stuck because they'd built everything around the assumption that I would be there to stop her, that even when removed, I would somehow still protect what I used to hold together. I didn't break the structure, I just didn't hold it up anymore. The report that triggered everything still had my name on it. Not in bold, not as author, but tucked in the section marked Technical Review, right beside Ava's. That one line had become the question mark at the center of a growing investigation. Malik asked me to meet. No small talk, no delay. He held a folder when I arrived. I didn't need to read it. I knew what was inside. Submission logs, version histories, timestamp records, approval flows. "You're listed as technical reviewer," he said. I nodded. I didn't contribute. "Your name is on the file. It was autofilled. They reused an old template. I didn't edit, I didn't log in, and I didn't read the draft." He flipped through the pages, slow and deliberate. "It shows no access from your credentials." He paused. "Ever." I said nothing. The silence between us didn't feel tense. It felt exact. He didn't suspect me. He needed a fact confirmed. And I gave it to him. Malik closed the folder. "Thank you, that's all." It was short, clean, like everything I used to send when the system still made sense. By the end of the day, leadership requested a written statement from everyone listed on the project, not to assign blame, at least not yet, but to preserve timelines. Jared looked uneasy. Ava stayed quiet. I drafted mine in 10 minutes. Removed from validation authority as of March 12th, no knowledge, access, or review of the report in question. I did not request, nor was I asked, to participate informally. That was all I submitted. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It was a list of decisions they made, followed by actions I respected. If they wanted to rewrite the story, they would have to erase timestamps. And those don't disappear quietly. Later that week, Ava was placed on leave. No announcement, no explanation. Her badge stopped working, and someone else cleared her desk. The company didn't say she was at fault. They said they needed clarity, but the files had already spoken. They showed who moved what, who approved what, and who did nothing, because they were no longer expected to. The CEO passed me in the hallway one morning. He gave a slight nod, like a man walking past a power line he used to ignore. He didn't ask me to come back into the project. He didn't thank me for staying quiet. He didn't even speak. That was fine. I wasn't waiting for their recognition. I was waiting for the story to write itself. Ava hadn't made a mistake. She'd made a choice, without realizing the structure behind her was no longer reinforced. And now, the company was standing in the wreckage of an assumption that people who are removed still quietly stay. That names can be left in files like signatures with no responsibility. That silence equals consent. But silence in my case had always meant, this no longer belongs to me. And what happens next is not mine to hold. The leadership team tried to frame it as a misstep. One report, one signature, one learning opportunity. They wanted it boxed up. Filed away as an error and oversight, nothing more. But audits don't work on narratives. They work on numbers. And Malik wasn't done. He started tracing back every submission that listed both my name and Ava's over the past quarter. And what he found wasn't a pattern of one mistake. It was a system of shortcuts. Versions were rushed. Approval steps were missing. Names were copied across files without any corresponding action. And I had proof, because I had logged every one of them the moment I saw it. Not to report, to remember. I didn't write accusations, I wrote timestamps, and now those dates lined up exactly with the data Malik was surfacing. No access from me, no edits, no sign-ins on days I was listed as the final reviewer. When he called me in again, his tone was different. Not investigative. Now it was technical. "I need confirmation that these files were not touched by you, any of them." He laid out the stack. I scanned the headers, then said what I knew. All submitted without my involvement. Each one reused a reporting shell created before I was removed. I wasn't aware of their use until clients responded. Malik didn't ask follow-ups. He just nodded, the same way someone nods when the last piece falls into place. By the end of the week, the company received a formal letter from a second client, one we hadn't heard from since Q1. They were initiating an external review. They wanted to audit our trial data, all of it. The numbers weren't adding up, and they were ready to look for the reason why. Leadership called it unexpected scrutiny, but anyone paying attention knew better. It wasn't scrutiny, it was consequence. That Friday, I got a call from HR. Not to discipline, not to reassign, but to discuss clarification of past scope and access. I arrived with one page. It listed the day I was removed from Research Authority, the systems I'd been locked out of, and the only sentence I ever repeated in every email they ignored. This falls outside my current role. The HR manager read it, slowly. Her hands trembled just a little. "Do you want to make a statement?" she asked. "I already did," I said. "You just weren't listening when I said it the first time." By Monday, the company had paused all outbound research reports. They issued an internal memo with the headline, "Temporary Freeze Pending Compliance Review." It didn't mention Ava, or me. But Jared came to my desk that morning and said quietly, "They're rewriting everything, from scratch." I looked at him and asked, "And who's checking the rewrites?" He didn't answer, because now no one knew who was watching. The safety net had walked out months ago, and now everything beneath it was showing where it had always been thin. They thought they could rewrite the file, not the data, just the names. After the freeze, leadership scrambled to regain control. They sent out an internal announcement full of buzzwords: streamlining, data harmonization, operational reset. It meant one thing: damage control. Every research report from the last quarter would be reprocessed, every name rechecked, every step resubmitted. They said it was for alignment, but what they really wanted was detachment, to shake off the trail that led back to me. Because my name had lived in the corner of every flawed file Ava touched, and now it was burning through every layer of denial. They never expected me to keep a personal log. They definitely didn't expect Malik to have pulled archive access before anyone gave him permission. But he had. I never asked him why. He never said. But I suspect we both understood the same thing. When people are too quick to erase, it's because they're hiding something. HR reached out again, this time with a new tone. "We'd like to discuss your potential involvement in process restructuring. Not compensation, not apology, just strategy." I accepted the meeting, not to agree, but to be present. Because presence, when withheld long enough, becomes leverage. They asked me what I'd need to help redesign the system. I said, clarity. They asked if I'd be open to a formal oversight role again. I said, "You removed me. You reused me. You didn't ask when you needed protection, only now that you need proof." They blinked. One of them shifted in his chair. Another cleared her throat and asked, "What would you want in writing?" I opened my notebook. One sentence. "No one is accountable for work outside the scope they're compensated to perform." They read it. Twice. Then I closed the notebook and walked out. Jared caught up with me later that afternoon. "I backed up your old approval logs," he said. "Before they deleted the shared folders." I looked at him. "You don't need to cover me." "I'm not," he said. "I'm covering the truth. That's different." He was changing, quietly, but fully. That evening, Malik sent me a final note. "My report's in. Everything tied to your name post-March is unsupported by system access." One sentence. That's all. I didn't celebrate. I didn't share it with anyone. Because this wasn't victory, it was confirmation. The reports they tried to rebuild were already too broken. Not because of content, but because they couldn't separate responsibility from assumption. They had let someone else drive the process with my signature still lingering behind the wheel. And now, every file that bore that signature, without action to support it, was a liability. The system didn't forget. It logged every missed checkpoint, every copied field, every fake validation. They could replace faces. They could change who sat where. But they couldn't overwrite what had already been recorded. That's the danger of digital trails. They don't care who's in charge. They only follow who acted and who didn't. Ava was gone. No statement. No explanation. Her profile disappeared from internal systems over the weekend, and by Monday, someone else was sitting at her desk. Quiet, temporary, clearly not ready. They didn't call it a termination. They called it realignment. That word was getting used more often now. Realignment, reassignment, reassessment. Everything but responsibility. I thought that might be the end. I had kept my head down, stayed precise, and let the audit speak for itself. I had done what they told me, and when they stopped including me, I didn't fight to stay. But the gap I left didn't close. It widened. The first sign came in a small email, one line buried in a broader update from a long-standing client. They asked, "Will Rachel be involved in the final check?" Just like that. Simple. Director, no drama. But it cracked something. A day later, a different partner sent a correction request. Not to the project lead, not to the new analyst. They sent it to me. Not out of confusion, out of expectation. Because for years, I had been the last set of eyes before approval. The one who asked the hard questions, rewrote the phrasing, chased missing variables. Quietly, without fanfare. Now they were noticing I wasn't there. Internally, it caused friction. A director stopped me in the hallway. "Could you just glance at the new validation report? Off the record?" I told him. "There is no off the record. Not anymore." That's what happens when your silence becomes traceable. When every absence starts to form a shape that others can't ignore. I wasn't doing anything to get noticed, but that was the point, because what I had done before was no longer being done. Jared sent me a message that afternoon. "They're trying to find a version of you that's easier to control." I replied. "They'll find someone faster, but not steadier." The next morning, HR called me in for a growth conversation. It was framed as an invitation. Would I consider rejoining the data verification group under a redesigned title? They were willing to revisit compensation. They'd spoken to leadership. They were open. I didn't say yes. I handed them a printed copy of the message I'd written months earlier. Removed from oversight March 12th. I no longer contribute to processes not formally within scope or compensation. Then I added something new at the bottom. If my presence was optional, then so is my return. They didn't push back. They couldn't. Because I hadn't made myself essential. I had just done my job completely, and when I stopped, the gaps I left behind weren't noisy. They were structural. That same week, Malik announced he was leaving. No drama, no resignation letter broadcast. Just a private note he sent me on his last day. They tried to fix the policy, but what they really needed to fix was their memory. I saved that message. Because in the end, nothing I did was loud. Not the refusal, not the documentation, not the silence. But when I left his space, that space didn't shrink. It grew. And now, clients were asking questions leadership couldn't answer. Because no one in the new system had earned trust the way the old one had lost it. I didn't return. Not out of pride, out of precision. They had removed my role, erased my access, and reused my name without consent. And when it all collapsed, they offered me the one thing they'd never offered before, a proper seat. But by then, I no longer needed one. The structure I once supported had already fallen, quietly, cleanly, under the weight of its own shortcuts. And I had already moved. A private research institute had approached me during the final weeks of the audit. They didn't ask for credentials. They asked for clarity. "We want a system where responsibility doesn't disappear into titles," the director said. "We want processes that don't rely on invisible labor." I didn't overthink it. I accepted. There were no welcome posters, no press releases, just trust. They gave me full autonomy to write the foundation from scratch. The first clause I wrote was this: accountability begins and ends where compensation is defined. Simple, clear, non-negotiable. They implemented it immediately, and nothing has broken since. 3 months later, Jared reached out. He didn't ask for a role. He asked if I had space for someone who wanted to learn the part of the job most people ignore. I did. He joined with no title, just a checklist, a sharp eye, and the will to question what looks good enough. He told me, "They're still trying to replace you back there. They've renamed the role 3 times, but the clients don't trust the new names." I wasn't surprised. You can't rename what you never understood. A few weeks after that, Malik sent me a short note. He had taken a contract with a multinational regulatory board. His message only said, "They're still debating how the collapse happened. I gave them your name, not to blame, to study." I replied, "Let them study, but tell them to follow the log, not the logo." Because that was the story. I wasn't the hero. I wasn't the saboteur. I was just the person who stopped protecting a system that stopped respecting my boundaries. And when that protection was gone, what they called collapse was just gravity. I didn't make noise. I didn't post my version of the truth. I didn't demand anything back. But clients noticed. And when timelines slipped, when reports came in half-checked, when assumptions failed and there was no one left to quietly clean them up, they started asking for me. Not for my face, not for my opinion, for my method. And so, without stepping back into the same room, I re-entered the industry. Not as a comeback, as a standard. That's legacy. Not when they remember your name in meetings, but when they rebuild their process in the shape of what you use to hold steady. I didn't reclaim my seat. I rebuilt the table. And this time, I wrote my own name.